Welcome everyone to join us for today's webinar. My name is Paul Dabbar. I'm a Distinguished Visiting Fellow here at Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy, and I was formerly Undersecretary for Science at the U.S. Department of Energy. This is the third session of the Columbia Energy Tech Revolution Forum for this semester, and today we're going to discuss wind technology and policy. Let me quickly say that this event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you joining via Zoom, you can submit questions for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Why is this wind topic so timely? In the last 20 years, wind power has gone from an underperforming technology with near zero contribution to the overall energy mix in the US in the year 2000, to now being a contributor of 8.4% of all electricity supply and rising fast. And 20 years ago, the cost per megawatt hour of wind was very high, and now in many cases cheaper than other types of generation in certain locations and types. The reduction in cost and the large deployment of wind technology has been one of the large victories for energy technology innovation in the last generation. And it will likely continue to grow in deployment for many decades to come. But much of the clean energy policy community has little exposure to the specifics of the history of wind technology and policy, as well as the specific current state of technology prospects or specific policies that make sense in today's industry. Today, we're going to focus on the prospects of those advances and making a difference to energy transition, inform the broader energy policy community of those prospects and what additional policies might accelerate those prospects. This session will feature three industry leader efforts of wind technology and investment who have significant exposure to what has worked, what has been more challenging, and what policy should be targeted to advance the sector. First up will be Michael Sullivan, the former Senior Vice President at Nextera in charge of the renewables business. Under his leadership, he took a nascent wind business at the company in the early 2000s and was responsible for building out over 30,000 megawatts of wind, solar, and storage, with 10,000 megawatts under construction in the pipeline currently. That would be the equivalent of 30 large nuclear power plants of capacity. He has unsurpassed exposure to wind technology and policy over the last 20 years. And he's literally been on the ground securing land rights, purchasing and installing turbines, negotiating with power customers, and in state capitals and in DC, negotiating policy. Mike is in a unique position of knowledge on any topic on wind. He will be joined by John Eber, the former CEO of JPM Capital Corporation, the tax capital investing arm of JP Morgan Chase, the largest private sector bank in the world. Under his leadership, JPM was able to identify the very early days of the wind sector, the potential for the production tax credit, and has subsequently led over $17 billion in renewables of all different types, including, for the most part, wind. He effectively invented the wind tax equity market, not only for JP Morgan to invest its capital, but also create the PTC syndicate market from scratch, broadening the capital availability and reducing the costs. He's also a member of the board of Infrastructure and Energy Alternatives and EPC and was a senior advisor at Blackstone. Combined, Mike and John have built over 35% of all the wind, and the nearest, the number three is at 8%. So the two of them have absolutely dominated construction over the last generation. And the third panelist, Kimberly Osborne, is counsel at Eversource Energy and a leader in the fast-growing offshore wind sector, supporting the Eversource Ørsted offshore wind joint venture, which is currently building 3 projects in the Northeast region. She has significant experience advancing the energy's competitive energy business and interest in the ISO and RTOs, as well as FERC and other regulatory transactional matters. She has particular experience in interplay between state policy and FERC policy and wholesale markets, and has worked at the state of Connecticut. So I'd like to first pass off for first 5-minute comments to Michael Sullivan from Nextera.
Thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, everybody. I Michael Sullivan. Just to be clear, I retired last year from Nextera after 19 plus years doing what Paul was kind enough to describe. Looking forward to today and discussing things with everybody on this call. I understand there's perhaps as many as 400 people dialed in for this. A little background on Nextera. I'll probably say we a few times. We are the largest company many folks have never heard of, and we were pretty proud of that moniker. In recent years, it's hard to avoid us being known, or at least Nextera being known. We've gone, and over the last 20 years that Paul was describing, from roughly under the leadership of our two most recent chairmen, our current chairman, Mr. Robo, and then his predecessor, Mr. Hay, we went from about a $10 billion market cap utility to now the largest market cap utility in the world the last 5 or 7 years, upwards of 160 billion. Some of that's the renewable program. Some of that is a wonderful rate-based utility serving 60+% of Florida. And then some of that's just the market dynamics of the last 5 or 10 years with low interest rates and high multiples for renewable companies or companies that are succeeding in the energy transition. Why did Nextera get in wind? Same reason it's still in wind. Its primary reason is to serve customers and shareholders. In the early years, from maybe 01 or before, when we started making large investments, 01, we put the first billion in. There were some early investments in the late 80s and 90s in some older wind farms that Paul mentioned earlier. But the significant bets started in about 2001. And from about 01 and 08, it was purely shareholder focus. Nobody talked about green energy. It wasn't trendy to worry about sustainability. Terms like that were not being used like they get thrown around the last 5 or 10 years. And certainly the acronym ESG wasn't out there yet. But from the 2001 to 2008 phase, we mostly just focused on the Midwest, where wind was pretty cheap and what we called economic. And that was a key underpinning of almost all the projects we did, probably 90%, and the company still does today under my successor and others, that largely where the customer wants wind, which is generally sub 2 cents, maybe sub 3 cents wholesale price. And largely in recent years, the reason that is a dwindling number of states is because solar is so competitive and so cheap in the 2 to 4 cent range wholesale in probably 30 to 35 states across the U.S. So as the program expanded and surprised all of us, and as large as the market's become, especially here in the U.S. with well over 100 gigawatts going towards 200 gigawatts over the next 5 or 10 years, it's tremendous growth that none of us saw coming. And part of that was the sustainability of getting regular extensions of the PTC from 2009 right up through 2016. And then again, in recent parlance, even though it was getting phased down, it gave some certainty with some of the COVID-related legislation that gave some, to use a golf term, mulligans going forward the next few years on the phase-out years and give some certainty to investors around it. So what really was the focus, it became mainstream and competed very well with natural gas on a variable basis and coal and also other forms of energy, even though wind is pretty much an energy-only product and not as firm and not nearly as firm as some of the other technologies that are part of that. And then the last several years became a big program, became a big part of the investor messaging and a big part of the company's growth prospects, along with some phenomenal rate base and great customer service in Florida around the FPL franchise. So two of the bigger things the company is known for in the last 5 or 10 years, and something we were very lucky to be part of. And we had a great team and hundreds of, probably thousands of people dealing with it every day. And largely the company, through its growth phase and still growing, was agnostic about technology. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about technology today, but we largely didn't care who the vendor was. We cared from a financial point of view on certainty and financial wherewithal and certainty of getting delivery when we wanted turbines, especially when tax credit expirations were nearby. But the counterparty for major equipment purchases, while we did most of our business the last 10 or 15 years with General Electric Company, we still bought turbines from other vendors and were largely agnostic from that. So looking forward today to discuss that. And I think it's hard not to discuss wind today in 2021 without a little sprinkling of storage and solar. I think if we had had this same discussion 5 years ago, solar would have been limited to 3 states out west, and even then not economic. But today, it's such a good choice, and you've got close to almost probably by the end of next year or the year after, over 200 gigawatts of wind and solar installed in the United States, which is a phenomenal number. So I'll pass the baton to John here and await further interaction.
Thanks, Mike. And Paul, thank you for having me here today. Certainly a pleasure to be here with you and Mike and Kim and talk about one of my favorite topics, wind power and renewable energy. Although I retired from JP Morgan a few years ago, I've stayed involved in the industry, and I'm really enjoying being involved and assisting the growth and development, and appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. Looking back over the past 25 years or so being involved with production tax credits, I first started considering wind power PTCs as an attractive financing opportunity probably in about 1997. I never envisioned it would grow as rapidly as it has, and although the growth started slowly, it's really been turbocharged in the last decade or so, and I'm proud to have contributed to that growth. What I thought I'd do is give a couple quick overview comments on what really made the tax equity marketplace work for wind. And the first thing that really helped was the PTC. I don't know how many people understand it, but the production tax credit was invented to be a price subsidy, and it was available to anybody who installed wind power in the U.S. and sold the output to an unrelated third party. And they received the PTC for 2 years from the date the plant was built and put into service. And this price subsidy, which most of the time I was involved with, it was around low $20 a megawatt hour. I think rose as high as about $30 a megawatt hour. Right now, $18 a megawatt hour, as it's on a phase out that was instituted a number of years ago. But it allowed wind to be competitive with other forms of power. And the interesting thing about the PTC is I see it as the benefit went through the utilities to the ratepayers. Essentially, you could buy clean, renewable energy at a price that was subsidized by the PTC that allowed the ratepayers to find it attractive. And the PTC for wind, a lot of people don't realize it, but it wasn't a new concept. There was a PTC in existence that looked a lot like the wind PTC for natural gas all during the 90s. Most all the shale gas developed in this country during the 90s received a PTC that looked just like the wind PTC. And I got involved first in monetizing production tax credit assets for natural gas. And it was that experience and that opportunity that positioned myself and my firm, JP Morgan, to move into the renewable energy business in about the year 2000. The other thing that worked really well are the state RPSs, the Renewable Portfolio Standards. Many states have these. I think last number I saw was about 35 different states with RPSs. They were instituted, a lot of them in the early 2000s by state legislatures, managed by the public utility commissions. And these RPSs really helped the industry grow significantly, stimulating demand in the early 2000 era. And the other item I'd like to mention in terms of really helping the market was the growth of the OEMs. Mike mentioned a little bit about equipment manufacturers. When we first started looking at the marketplace, that was our largest concern, was what would the equipment last for the 20-year life of the contract? Would it produce the power that it was supposed to produce? And over the years, larger companies moved in, provided solid long-term warranties, produced really good equipment. And the industry, I think, really thrived because of the maturity on the manufacturing side and got away from some of the early problems that wind power is known for back around 1990. And the last comment I'd like to make in terms of what worked and helped the market is I'll give a little shout out to the US government, to the Treasury Department, and to the IRS. They're not usually known for helping stimulate industrial activity as much as try to regulate it. But these tax credit investments were highly structured. They created a certain element of tax risk for the investors. And the IRS in 2007, with the cooperation of the industry, issued a revenue procedure that's become quite famous, and it really made a significant difference in the industry, allowed us to bring in more investors to participate with us, created a safe harbor for those of us who were investing in these assets, such that we were comfortable the government wasn't going to challenge whether or not we were an owner in the project and it had a right to utilize these tax benefits. So that safe harbor still exists today, and here we are 15 years later, and those structures that were approved at that time continue to be those being utilized in today's market. And then quickly, I'll mention a couple items that didn't work and then wrap it up and hand it off to Kim. Some of the early policies, many of the early policies relative to PTCs were very short term, and sometimes just a year. And the extensions were coming annually, made it difficult for the industry to plan for the long term, and I think slowed down the growth of renewable energy. In latter years, we've had longer term extensions of the credit, and certainly the market's been much better off for it. And some of the state benefits were actually very short term as well, and a number of them, state tax credits and other kinds of state benefits, were actually retroactively changed. So short term policies or policies that could be retroactively adjusted were not helpful for the marketplace. And then finally, the structures in the early wind days were actually, in my opinion, more like tax shelters than they were economic investment opportunities. And anytime you have tax benefits, you have to be careful. They're not designed in such a fashion that they're going to attract people who are more interested in tax shelter than they are in the underlying economics of the project. And once we've got more institutional investors, banks, other strategic owner operators involved who are heavily focused on the economic opportunity, the market took off. So it's important, I think, to stay away from structures and tax benefits that can be conducive to more of a tax shelter type investor. With that, I'll stop here and pass it over to Kim.
Thanks, John. And thank you, Paul, for assembling this wind panel today. And I also want to say thank you to everyone who is tuned in for this momentous wind discussion. I'm honored to be on this panel with Mike and John, as between the three of us, I think we cover a very broad range of subject matter expertise and insights when it comes to the wind industry. So at this moment, offshore wind development in the US is really on the cusp of booming. It's really cool. The first 2 federal approvals for offshore wind ever were just recently issued by the Federal Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, or BOEM. The first project that received approval is Vineyard Wind. That's an 800 megawatt project interconnecting Massachusetts. And that project has commenced construction. And the second approved project is one of my companies, along with Ørsted, our joint venture, one of the joint venture projects, South Fork Wind. So we received our NEPA, or National Environmental Policy Act, record of decision, the ROD, just a few days ago. And we stand ready to start construction in January. It's just a really exciting time that things are actually happening, actual construction, actual procurements. The rubber's really hitting the road. But before these 2 federal approvals were issued just recently, there had been a BOEM pause, a federal permitting pause, while the agency took a step back to assess its approach to the NEPA cumulative impact review processes for offshore wind. So for several years now, we've had projects contending with uncertainty, not knowing if and when we would be receiving this critical, really required to start construction, this approval. So there have been a lot of challenges, and it's very promising and very exciting that the federal permitting process is starting to pick up pace. But I've already, I think, jumped too far ahead in the offshore story here. So before we dive in, I'll talk a bit about my background in offshore wind and harken back to the initial state policy moments that think really served as the ignition for this tremendous development we're seeing today. In 2016, the state of Massachusetts enacted, at that time, what was unprecedented legislation authorizing the procurement of 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind. And shortly thereafter, the state issued an offshore request for proposals, or RFP. I'll put on I used to work for the state of Connecticut. I'll put my policymaker hat on for a moment. So RFPs are one of a top favorite tool for policymakers to move things forward according to policy goals. So Massachusetts kind of led the pack back in 2016 and procured 800 megawatts, that Vineyard Wind project that I just mentioned, that they received their federal approval. Connecticut was not far behind and procured a few offshore wind projects right after Massachusetts did. I really want to illustrate how rapidly offshore wind development is moving, this rapid pace. So that 800 megawatt procurement that Massachusetts completed in 2016, it sounded huge, but now today 800 megawatts, some may not even consider that a large project at all. Notably, New York State's most recent offshore wind RFP procured 2,500 megawatts. And a lot of project developers are designing 1,200 megawatt size projects these days. So it just goes to show in 5 years, states are procuring more than double what they were procuring 5 years ago. And they're saying that it's only going to increase in speed and magnitude from here. So a lot up and coming for offshore wind. So it's exciting now, but I think there's even much more excitement yet to come. So jumping back to today, now I serve as in-house counsel at Eversource Energy, as Paul mentioned earlier, and I am specifically dedicated to the offshore wind projects with our joint venture partner, Ørsted. And we're currently building 3 projects. The first is that South Fork Wind project I mentioned, and that's 130 megawatts, and that will interconnect in East Hampton, in Long Island, New York, so to the NYISO control area. So we've gone through that NYISO interconnection process, and we made it through quite successfully. Another project we have interconnecting in New York into the NYISO area is Sunrise Wind. That's an over 900 megawatt project, and also the first project in the US to decide to use HVDC technology. And then our third project is Revolution Wind, and that's about 800 megawatts, and that project will interconnect to Davisville, Rhode Island, so to the ISO New England control area. So yeah, again, South Fork is our most advanced project with an expected commercial operation date, or COD, of Q4 2023. And we are ready, ready at the gates to begin construction in January. So I'll conclude there and very much look forward to the discussion, Paul.
Okay, great. Well, look forward to this conversation with the 3 of you. So I will go ahead and kind of start with kind of go back to a little bit of the ancient history topics that Mike and John has started talking about. So obviously, wind has become one of the greatest successes in energy tech in the last 20 years. The first time I saw a wind farm was outside of Livermore, California, around 1991. And I didn't see a turbine spinning, and subsequently Canatech filed for bankruptcy. For those of you who are of a certain age and know a certain history of things, Mike and John, you two came into leadership when there was bankruptcies, right? And it was perception was failure, right, of the technology and maybe policy. But which is why I want to ask you. And obviously, you built markets when they weren't working, to be blunt, right? Based on that. So could you talk a little bit about what went through your heads and your strategies of at least John and Mike, what you went through when the market was not working, so to speak, technology and policy, and what do you think really got it from the bankruptcy stage to the growth stage, and what worked during that time frame when there weren't a lot of believers?
Yeah, John, I'll start, and please just interrupt me as you see fit. I think the big year, 2000 was a decent sized year, but 2001 was the first time the U.S. built over $1 billion worth of wind. This was before tax equity. PTCs had been around, and as John said, they used to sunset every 12 or 24 months, and the extensions came in arrears, and basically you just had 1 year to develop things in the 2000 through 2007 or 8 time period. But I think the biggest thing that lit the fuse was very few people knew Kenetech and understood it. And in 2001, we were able to do, as an industry, and I know at Nextera, we were called FPL back then, we did just under 1,000 megawatts in 2001, and then again in 2003. And those 2 years, 2002 was a very small year because the PTC didn't get renewed until the fourth quarter or the third quarter. But that wind was very economic at the time. It was 1, 2, 3 cent kilowatt hour, 10, 20, $30 a megawatt hour, primarily Midwest utilities. There was a lot of demand forced through some California utilities back then, but it hadn't really realized yet until later in the decade. But it got a lot of attention from Midwest utilities. And in that period, that allowed, and there was a lot of risk. You had to have a cheap product for them to take a chance on it, because they saw it as those utilities back at that time period, they didn't even want you to interconnect with them. They were afraid, like some of them were afraid of solar 5 or 8 years ago, and like some are afraid of storage or new storage technologies today. Not afraid as in fear of somebody getting hurt necessarily. It was more just, this is not in our wheelhouse. This is not normal for us. How do we handle this? And some of the leading utilities that were big buyers of wind and still are, especially the Excel companies up in the upper Midwest and in Colorado, Minnesota, places like that, and West Texas and parts of Oklahoma, if they hadn't been the customer willing to get out there and do it first in a decent size, along with some of the other Oklahoma and Texas utilities, I don't know if the demand would have showed up until costs came back down after the large increases in 2006 through 2009 due to oil going to $100 a barrel and a lot of other things, steel getting very expensive. But I like to think some of that. And then I give a lot of credit to another bankruptcy that you didn't mention, Paul. There was a company in Houston that is rather infamously known for other reasons today called Enron. And I always point to Enron's bankruptcy in 2003 as one of the big moments for wind also. Because as part of that bankruptcy, they had to sell some operating wind farms to guys like us and John and other people, which were not sizable today, looking back on it. But the biggest thing that happened in that Enron bankruptcy was in late 2002, early 2003, they started spinning out a manufacturing division where they made turbines. And a company called GE bought it. And when that happened in 2003, because of the special relationship Nextera at the time called FPL had with General Electric and others, suddenly, to what John touched on earlier, I don't think Siemens entered in until about 2005, if I remember correctly. But that was a seminal moment for technology, because now you had somebody who understood R&D, who understood markets, who understood supply chains and logistics. And prior to that, folks that made wind turbines, especially the only guys we could buy them from in 2001, 2002, and 2003 were largely Vestas and coming from overseas. And they were largely focused on the Western European market. They didn't understand how electricity got sold in the United States. So at the time, so when GE came in, I think that was a big event, Paul, for lighting the fuse, having the memories of Kenetech get forgotten. And then also, we had gone through 2 or 3 PTC expirations and renewals in 2000 through 2005 and 6. And people started getting the public policy side of it that John alluded to earlier. But it was largely a Midwest business, the central time zone and the mountain time zone, and still is. And I would argue that's where it's going to be the next 10 years. But that's my view. I don't know, John, if you have a...
I agree with you. It's interesting. we looked at the industry for 4 or 5 years before we made our first tax credit investment. And what Paul is describing, was the biggest challenge to overcome. How do you take a major financial institution, put them into a whole new business, wind power, and get them to do something where there's been bankruptcies? And you don't do that. You don't do that until there's been good success stories. And so we needed to see the success stories, and we needed to see big players who were experienced and could help me convince the guys upstairs that it was safe and reasonable for us to get involved. And it wasn't until 2000 that I finally got to that point. And it wasn't until 2001 or 2 that we made our first investments, not for want of trying, but it took a while to develop the financial engineering. So you talk a lot about technology maturing. We needed to find the financial technology through which we could make these investments and still have the acceptable risk level for our financial institution that would allow us to go forward and close the deal. So about 2001 or 2, I think we finally closed our first deals, just as the equipment was evolving and maturing, as you've described, Mike, and just as bigger players like FPL and others were setting a standard and showing that there were good economic deals out there where you could predict the wind and you could operate the equipment and you could get a return over a longer period of time. That wasn't just a fabrication of somebody's spreadsheet, but it was actually, it was being recognized. So it took it almost took a decade from the time, Paul, you were talking, when things first started with wind, because the PTC, I think, was originally created in '92. It took almost a decade before we did our first deal from the time that started. And there was probably a 5 or 6 year period there where there was just no way I could have gotten a major financial institution to do what it is we were doing in 2002. So it just took time, and it took establishing a track record so that we could get in there and help out our clients.
And I think, Paul, most people would get a chuckle from 2001 till about 2007, till John's mentioned about tax equity showing up or in decent size or decent capacity. There were only 3 large investors in wind at the time, and I think John would agree, besides FPL, which was probably 30 to 50% of the market in those early years, Shell Oil Company, and then when Mid-American Energy, a subsidiary of Berkshire, got involved with rate-based wind in Iowa in about 03, 04, 05. And those were the 3 large name brand guys, which today you would almost chuckle in an energy transition oil and gas discussion that Shell was right there with us in Berkshire in the early days.
That was a different tax equity was able to make, much to your chagrin at the time, was that those players you mentioned all were able to use the tax credits themselves. And our role was to help other folks who wanted to be strategic owners of the assets but couldn't use the tax benefits to help them get involved as well. And
so let's jump forward to current technologies. What's kind of in the current portfolio? What's happened? I want to start with offshore wind. What's happening from a technology point of view? Do you see today that's been built or has a possibility of being built? And by the way, not just turbines, right? There's lots of other things around that besides turbines that are important. But if the 3 of you, starting with Kim, could comment to what you're seeing from a technology point of view, that's kind of new, or where we're at, and where we're going.
Sure. So for offshore wind, I would be remiss if I didn't say that the turbines are a major focus of pushing that technology forward. And this is another point of illustration of how fast things are moving. The Block Island Wind Farm, which hit COD, or commercial operation, in late 2016, those were 6 megawatt turbines. Now we're procuring 15 megawatt turbines 5 years later, so over double. And for offshore wind, it on a high level, it tends to be that the bigger the turbine is, the more benefit that that model would be for the project. More output, you need less of them out there in the ocean. For example, for our projects, we agreed to space them out by 1 nautical mile, one by one, all of the turbines. So that technology is an important aspect going on in this space. But aside from that, there's also the HVAC versus HVDC inquiry, and that choice, would depend on the specifics of the particular project. What would be best to get those electrons to shore. For Sunrise, HVDC made a lot of sense because it's just one shot, long export cable. I think it's over 50 miles of offshore export cable. So that we're getting a better handle on that technology area. And then I would have to say for offshore wind, it's so early. There is no grid scale offshore wind project that has been built in the US. So we're still waiting to actually see, like, in reality, how these things operate, the characteristics, how they perform, what they provide. We're still waiting to see that, and fortunately we'll see that soon with 2 projects essentially underway with construction. So what we're seeing for technology advancements are kind of on the nuts and bolts level, like improving our understanding as to how to optimize our protection and control elements. Synchronous condensers are a big deal. Certain elements that modulate the power when it gets to shore, because if you're bringing, let's say, 1,000 megawatt project to shore, there's a lot of infrastructure that has to be built for that to safely happen. So right now for offshore wind, technological advancements are somewhat on a nuts and bolts level, but once we see actual projects operating and how they operate, how they perform, their characteristics, then things are really going to take off in cooler ways.
Paul, if I could add a couple things I think that were missed. The key thing is taller towers and longer blades from a technology point of view. In 2001, the industry was putting wind turbines, the same design, nacelle blade configuration, on 50-meter towers. Today, the industry standard onshore is somewhere in the 85 to 105 range, a little higher in some places, and is largely limited by the incremental cost of steel and foundations as you go up. If you're selling power for a penny or two, and you go higher, even if the FAA or the military bases that might nearby let you go higher, the economics probably don't make sense. They make sense in Western Europe because the incremental cost of the energy you produce might be 3, 5, or 7 cents a kilowatt hour due to feed-in tariffs or just higher pricing regimes. But in the center part of the country, US, where most wind is getting built, economic wind, you're talking about 1 and 2 cent power. So the incremental cost to go up has to get more NCF, net capacity factor, out of it. And then the second biggest factor is blades getting longer. That same era, the rotor diameters of turbines in the 01 to 03 range were 47 meters. The hot unit we got from Vestas back in those days was called a V47. Today, those rotor diameters are 120, 140, 160 in diameter. And when you look at the engineering calculation on power from a wind turbine, is generally a function of radius cubed, if I recall correctly. So when you've gone from a piece of pizza that has a 47-meter diameter to one that's 140 meters in diameter, or 127 meters diameter, it's a lot more pepperoni as far as the swept area. That's what's driving it, along with going higher. And I'll use one example without talking about the customer or the project. We had one project in Minnesota that was built in '99 with older technology. It was repowered, or at least the contract was signed back in 2018 or 2019. It was repowered in 20 or 21. Construction might be getting finished this year. And the NCF of that project for its first 20 years was in the 23 to 26% range. And after it's repowered, it's north of 50. Same real estate, same real estate.
I was going to give a similar example, except I was about the break-even cost or the cost to sell the power to hit the return for the developer. I mean, I saw early deals at $70 a megawatt hour, and now they're at $10 a megawatt hour.
Right. And so what's happened is the PTC has kind of subsidized things even beyond cheap. So it's very economic against natural gas and other variable cost products. So I think those were the two biggest drivers. You had improvement in cable technology, better low voltage ride through, better O&M scale because the units are larger. But the units got larger because of blades and towers. And then some of the learning that went on in Western Europe, especially in solar and wind. So technology learning. And then I think one of the big benefits you got to give a tip of the hat to is John gave a PTC tip of the hat to the government. When the PTC started getting extended for 4 years at a time from about 2009 until today, and going forward, it's got some decent certainty the next 5 years or so. You gave the OEMs the opportunity to invest in R&D for the U.S. market. And right now, U.S. market's constrained onshore and to a certain degree anywhere because of logistics of getting the tower and the blades to the site, right? The highways, bridges, rail yards, and turning radiuses of getting these things delivered are what constrains the size, and along with the FAA and just approvals at the permitting level. But even if you stay about where you are today, it's the massive change in swept area, but blade length and tower increases, and then some improvements, especially in the field on construction technology, cabling, foundations, things of that nature. But that's minor. And then O&M scale, everyone's gotten better at O&M. And the ability to keep those costs down. So I think, but the two biggest ones I think you got to hit on are blade length and tower height.
Yeah. So let's shift to policy. I think there's kind of two big policy points. The three of you have all been mentioning it, but at least two I like to highlight is siting and PTC policy. Right, so to support policy, both of which are highly topical. Obviously, if you talk about NEPA, Kim was talking about NEPA previously. There's some things in NEPA, like some roads, 10-mile roads take 10 years for review, and they get really caught up in many different things. I mentioned roads, but obviously offshore wind has had a significant amount. And it's not just a wind, but the transmission, highly topical. There's lots of transmission have been proposed and not approved. And then the PTC point, a number of you have talked about, John in particular with you, talking about the volatility of policy and the impact of that. But there's obviously a big debate about the PTC right now because it started, John, as you described it, from a history point of view,
right,
from a policy point of view. But as Mike's pointed out, we've gotten prices down that the original intent of the PTC, which was to subsidize a technology that wasn't quite as competitive. Now it's incredibly competitive without a support. But a lot of people are.
That's true, Paul. But
pivoting
back to offshore wind, it may not be true when you get to offshore wind, and so. It may be more of a question of what markets are you talking about as to whether or not the PTC has now driven the price down to that point where it may not be necessary.
Yeah. So I'll ask you the three of you. You can bring up other policy points, but I at least brought the two what I call big ones. Kim, maybe we start with you. Once again, I mentioned NEPA and siting. I mentioned PTC and support policy points. But what do you think is the most important and or challenge today that you see, the three of you that you see, and it may be something other than those two?
So as for challenges, well, offshore wind, there's a lot of challenges, but just focusing in on siting, and then also PTC and John, I really appreciate your how you mentioned that there's a dynamic with the markets there, and it depends what market you're in. So with the PTC, I'll just say in December 2020, Congress passed legislation that was very helpful for offshore wind. Offshore wind projects can qualify as long as you start construction before Q4 2025. And there's a 10-year safe harbor. now, as opposed to the previous 4-year. But the tax, when you're talking about what kind of financial incentives or what all needs to be in place or available to be secured in order to build an offshore wind project, you have to think about what markets you're in. And for one of our projects, Revolution Wind, it's in ISO New England. And right now, for this capacity auction, all offshore wind was subject to what's called the minimum offer price rule, or MOPR. It's kind of a buzzword these days. So we are not able to even participate to bid in. So we won't be counted in the market either, towards the installed capacity requirement. So so then we're really, really, really glad that we have this PTC incentive available. Given that, I'll jump to siting just so we cover enough subject matter here. But so for siting for offshore wind, we have 2 jurisdictions. We're both in state jurisdiction and also federal jurisdiction, and we have to get approval from both. And the 2 processes are not streamlined or integrated together in any way at this time. So that makes things a little difficult. But we mitigate that difficulty by a lot of planning ahead, just very thorough planning. Our teams are formed with members, the business folks, the siting folks, everyone on the project team is at the top of their game, really. And there's a lot of preparation, like I said, that goes into it. Ways that this could improve is if there could be some streamlining between the 2 or efficiencies worked in. But I don't know if right now we would want to accelerate the review process per se. I mean, we don't, I think there's a difference between like a systemic problem where you're waiting 10 years or so, and so on due to systemic problems. But I don't know if we'd want to accelerate the review process right now, because under NEPA, there's the hard look requirement and a lot of process required. And the more thorough and complete that process is, the better positioned we are with that with that permit and that process, so that we're not vulnerable to challenges. So I'll stop there.
I think, Paul,
Yep.
one thing, I'd just throw out a short comment. I think the greatest challenge facing the wind industry today is to make offshore wind work, because I think we need it. The wind industry needs it, the country needs it, and the markets on the east and the west coast need it. And wind works great in the Midwest, but it's been a hell of a challenge on both coasts. And offshore is the potential solution for that. And as we move forward in terms of the equipment and the costs and the ability to get it permitted, I think all of those things have to find a way to come together. And that's probably the industry's greatest challenge. And that's where, as I just suggested earlier, that's probably where the PTC is still going to be necessary.
Well, I think it's overall permitting. 5 and 10, 15 years ago, permitting was different. Kim made a very good argument, which is of the 10 reasons why Nextera is not an offshore wind. She just gave about 4 of them why we've stayed out of it. We were in it. We were the only guy in it from 2003 to about 2006. We had a PPA under negotiation for a couple of years with Long Island Power Authority. It was not too different than the pricing we're seeing today. And we looked at the amount of capital, equity capital, and people you got to tie up for 5 and 10 years before you get your permits or before you even get close to COD or in construction, let alone threading the needle. And I can go to the 10 other reasons. But public policy and siting is probably always going to be the biggest thorn in the wind industry site, especially now that wind's biggest competitor is solar. Solar is a little less obtrusive. It's seen as less antagonistic to local permitting authorities. It's not as tall. It doesn't take up as much visual aesthetics. It's not seen generally if it's landscaped around the perimeter. And, I professionally and politely just disagree with John and Kim. Solar is your biggest enemy in the Northeast. You can build solar for $30 to $70 a megawatt hour at smaller scale or larger scale. Granted, land's not as plentiful, which is part of why wind is going in the water in the public policy driven markets. Those are not markets, those are public policy driven markets. Those projects are not economic against other choice of electricity, like wind and solar has to compete in 40 or 42 other states. But the United States is largely, Paul, as you know from your former job that you recently left, is really 50 different countries when it comes to electric policy. Georgia doesn't coordinate with Florida on a regular basis, nor does California, Nevada, or any two adjacent states. And offshore is going on because 5 or 7 states in the Northeast are very dominated from one side of the market, and they want to have it in their backyard like everyone else wants their own power plants in their backyard under their control. So that makes sense from that perspective. But from an economic point of view, it's growing orange groves and orange juice in North Dakota, not in Florida or Brazil for consumption. And the public policy decision, if we're going to worry about sustainability and the environment and emissions, is, where do you want to make that orange juice the cheapest if we all have to drink orange juice? And that electricity, whether it's solar or wind, should go in the 30 states where solar makes sense and the 5 or 10 or 15 states where wind makes sense, and not burden customers with the higher rates that come with certain choices or investors. Returns on offshore wind are below what onshore wind is. It's not a good decision for the institutional investors unless it's a rate-based function. And certain companies like Kim's and others are perhaps think they're going to make some money at it, but it's been almost 20 years that offshore wind has been trying to get something in the ground in the US. And if you burden that equity capital, which is what that venture capital that they've all been investing in at their companies the last 5 or 10 years since some of these mandates came from the East, and you burden it with an equity cost of capital, which it has been equity, I don't think those returns really will be what they're hoping to get. Now, maybe they will get those returns on a time zero basis from COD forward. I wouldn't doubt what they've been telling their investors. I'm sure it's accurate. But if you go backwards the last 3, 5, 7, and 9 years and put that burden on those spreadsheets, I'd wonder if that's truly true. So from a society point of view, we're just agree to disagree. But from a public policy point of view, I think all three of us would agree that siting and permitting are the difficult things going forward, no matter what you're building in this environment.
So let's switch to intermittency. It's been more of a topic in the UK, but and that's not an offshore versus onshore topic. It's just, it happens to be offshore in the UK. But the intermittency topic has kind of raised, and obviously, I think we all know from an engineering point of view that as we add more intermittent of whatever onto the electricity market, that we would start running into some challenges. The UK's run into that, obviously, where the wind stopped with net capacity factors for their wind, and caused significant price spikes, and bringing coal back online, which is quite interesting, to make up for the fact of the intermittency topic. Obviously there's some engineering solutions or maybe some other solutions. How do you all think about, because increasingly intermittency will probably be a challenge. It's just kind of, and the question of whether it's a little bit or a medium or a lot. And what are some of the solutions? How do you all think about your particular markets or customers that you're in, and this intermittency topic and solutions?
I'll just start. So just in terms of resource mix, so yes, wind is intermittent. That's the nature of it. The wind is not always blowing, but it is often blowing when the sun is not shining. So going back to Mike, your solar, I think both are needed for the resource mix. And I'll put my policymaker hat back on, or I guess integrated utility hat on. When you're thinking about an integrated resources plan, I think of it like a rainbow. And let's say offshore wind is red. It can't, if everyone shows up with red, that's not going to be that's not going to be the resource mix that's needed. So I think it'll come down to figuring out how how to configure our resource mix in a way that the power is always reliable. You know, figuring out synergies, like if hydro by wire down from Canada would firm up the intermittency of offshore wind, you know, engineers would have to study that. And then there's also the battery and hydrogen technologies and other emerging technologies of that nature that might help out this problem as well.
Yeah, I
Paul,
agree.
go ahead, John.
Storage. No, it's interesting. Everybody's talking about storage now as part of the solution, and it's coming on rapidly. And so I think we're going to see a lot more storage to help balance the solar and the wind. But pre-storage, you know, there's a couple of states that have already proven they can manage this. Minnesota and Iowa are a couple that come to mind. Very high percentage of wind power balanced into their system without any significant problems that you think of popping up and making headlines. And other geographic areas have been moving in that direction prior to getting storage in place. So I think the intermittency challenge is a little bit of a red herring sometimes, because all of these power systems, wherever they are, have a balance of different types of power production. And I don't think anybody's suggesting it should be all one type. The question is to get the balance that's as clean as you can get, if not carbon free. And that's, I think, the goal that everybody is working on it. And we've seen it proven to be able to get close to that, and by a few parts of the country already. And I think once we get a lot more storage in place, it'll help, because especially with the higher capacity factors that Mike was just quoting, when you can take wind from 20 to 50% capacity factors, you're making large steps toward minimizing the intermittency challenge.
Yeah, I think the intermittency has been going on forever, John. I mean, Paul, it's not going to go away. And the key is price and what makes a customer sign up. Now, if you remove the U.S. Northeast, where they don't really have customers, they have government policy that's mandating the market. Everybody else wants to see it priced a certain way. And the reason solar is so competitive at $20 to $40 is it's peak coincident. Load is much higher during the day, everywhere, almost year round. And it's much more predictable. Wind is a little less predictable a day ahead, a lot less predictable a day ahead than solar is. When you get a couple hours ahead, everybody kind of knows what's going to happen with decent high confidence. But when you're trying to keep the lights on and manage the grid, and you're not just a developer, or just a power purchaser of intermittent power, you have all these other responsibilities to society and to your customers, regulated customers or unregulated customers. And when that happens, the intermittency has to get managed. And if the price is right, they'll take the risk, and they'll have other power available to run firm, whether that's a gas turbine combined cycle or a nuclear or a coal unit. But public policy is changing as far as what those emissions can be. But you cannot have wind on every street corner. It just doesn't make sense economically, nor does it make sense from a policy, land use, or siting point of view. At some point, it makes sense to grow your orange groves in Florida or Brazil. And society has to come to that. And the 50 states will make their 50 different country decisions from an electric point of view. But the intermittency isn't going to get solved just one and done with storage, because storage right now has an advantage when paired with solar because of the ITC. And with wind, it's hard to get, there's some legislation being proposed where it will get a standalone ITC, hopefully with this new Build Back Better package, whatever it gets called, if it comes out of Congress and gets signed by the president. But that would be good for wind if that happened. But it's not a silver bullet to fix wind's intermittency.
So we have a number of questions also about innovation, like what could come next. Just to give a couple of examples, obviously, University of Maine in New England is looking at floating offshore wind as a technology. NREL, the National Renewable Lab, has been using supercomputing to try to optimize location. Mike, you and your team really did a lot of that a long time ago about trying to use computer modeling for optimal placement, which probably had at least some impact on NCF improvement. Another one, when I was undersecretary, Labs invented a robot that could be clamped onto to wind blades rather than sending people up there to do imaging and imaging faster for turbine blades, both for safety and actually just for kind of able to measure them. We think, if I remember correctly, worked with Nextera on testing some of the robotics for imaging of blades that were deployed. How do you all see, as companies or investors, what should that environment, that community look like between being a customer and buying these sort of potential new technologies that improve performance and operations and maintenance, versus how do you work with universities or national labs or developers of the OEMs who might be working on some of these new technologies?
Well,
I'll
Paul,
throw
I
in a
think,
few
go
just
ahead.
to kick, I guess. Yeah, sorry, Mike. I've been talking to a number of people over the last year about offshore wind, and there's two big markets in offshore. One is the fixed foundation, which is, I think, mostly what Kim has been talking about, and where a lot of the development is currently going. And then there's a whole second phase of that market, which is going to require floating foundations. And there's a lot of work going on there. You just mentioned one with the University of Maine, and there's some companies, mostly European, all European, I think, who are working on a number of other alternatives to floating foundations. So I find it a fascinating market, and one that's getting fed at just the right time with venture capital and other kinds of strategic capital to try to figure out a way to somewhat pivot off of what's been going on in the oil and gas industry offshore for a couple of decades. So I see the whole offshore wind area as one that's ripe for new technological development. It's going to require a lot of money. It's going to require money from strategics who are well capitalized. And interestingly enough, many of the people looking at offshore wind now fit that category. So I see that as an area where it's just ripe for a lot of technological improvement. And to the extent that that does happen or can happen, then that part of the industry will benefit and grow significantly.
I would agree with that, John.
Mike, you've had some ups and downs with different types of technology after over 20 years, and so how do you think the best way to I mean, obviously, to a large degree, Nextera's performance is due to a lot of knowledge on technology and not just turbines.
Yeah, well, we had the benefit of going through the gas turbine boom and bust mostly through and there was a great technology advances there, right? Heat rates have gone from 8,000 to below 6,000 now on combined cycle. Wind, as John and I and Kim have mentioned in the last 45 minutes or so, tremendous economies of scale, as has solar. I think when you look at technology advancement or new improvements to your question, whether it's O&M, blades, and special air, the big difference is we're almost, or an investor like Nextera, or even John with his tax equity, is almost like a venture capital investor or a private equity investor. It's shareholder money, and it has to have a return right then and there. And if a regulated utility or a investor is making something based on a public policy driven market where PPAs are mandated, like they were in California years ago, or some of the offshore projects, well, then the economics can be weighed against what's the incremental benefit or cost to that project or the winning bidder. But for 80 or 90% of renewables that get be built in this country, solar and onshore wind, along with storage and anything else, it's got to be economic to the customer, unless you're in California or a couple of the states in the Northeast. The customer is just not going to want to buy it or invest in it themselves if it's rate based, because it has to meet that economic criteria that so many other 40 or 42 states require. It has to be, beside prudent and good for the public good and all those kind of things that come through fuel clauses or PPA recovery costs or even rate base. So I think a lot of these are going to be here. They're happening. I think one thing that's happening, Paul, that didn't happen 10 or 20 years ago is the amount of private equity and venture capital that's flying into our sector. It's masked under energy transition or sustainability or companies wanting to look greener than they looked 5 or 10 years ago. But the tens of billions of experimental or R&D capital that's getting thrown in our sector is fantastic. And it's not a wind and solar only anymore discussion, whether it's the hope and desire around hydrogen 3, 5, and 10 years from now, or other technologies. That was not happening pre-2015 or pre-2012 when oil was $100 a barrel. And now we have oil at $60 a barrel, and it's not driving the investment. The investment's happening on its own because there is a desire to go with less emissions, but there's also a desire to make it economic. Very few of these technologies are getting talked about unless they can see a path to competing with existing technologies, which right now on the margin tend to be wind and solar and cheap natural gas.
Yeah, so I mean, for everyone listening, I'd just like to highlight something that I really wanted the three panelists here really hit. Coming from a time in DC and dealing with hardcore public policy, where you go to Washington DC today and it's about energy transition and it's about net zero and it's about vision, right? It's about these kind of big picture kind of topics. These are three people here who actually have to build things. And so if you're in the policy realm talking about, we're going to do this or that to try to incentivize, I think hopefully what's really interesting to everyone listening here is that the people who actually really build and run these things are investors, and we got three people here from different perspectives who are very big at this topic. And I think in particular, you heard Mike talk a lot about blocking and tackling, about approvals, and it has to be competitive based on alternatives, or maybe there is a little bit of policy, but it still needs, even if there is some policy from a certain state, it still has to be blocking and tackling about how it fits into costs, construction, operations. That certainly from my time in DC, many people don't see that. They don't even understand it. I think it's helpful, Mike, John, and Kim, for you guys to have talked about that. I got one last question here for the panel. Obviously, we could keep going on forever. I'd like to talk a little bit about the supply chain and about American manufacturing, American jobs, about the economic impact of the sort of things that public policy is encouraging for sometimes environmental reasons and so on. But one thing that I think a lot of people sometimes miss is that if the American taxpayer is subsidizing something, giving money out to a particular topic, politicians, rightfully so, not only care about some other topics like environmental impact and so on, but they care about the impact of their local community, including jobs. So when they talk about allocating American taxpayers, they go like, well, how many jobs is that creating? And currently, the current administration, the current secretary is visiting one of Kim's facilities today, and to be blunt, right? And it's about jobs onshore for offshore wind. I mean, that's today's visit by the secretary at Kim's facility, I think at a port, or basically there to support. It's not just about offshore, it's obviously kind of anywhere in the country. To some reasonable degree, wind has been okay because of GE, and GE's had a lot of construction of wind turbines, but there's a lot of other parts of the supply chain besides turbines. So can you all, I know it's a little bit not your direct realm, but put your hat on of like, if you're giving recommendations to members of Congress who care about as much about, jobs being created in the supply chain as they do care about the environmental impact of this particular technology, how would you recommend policy shift? Because you're procuring, you're hiring people, right? You're building, you're buying stuff from the supply chain. How would you recommend, from a policy point of view, that if the American taxpayer dollar is being spent on it, how would it be optimal to improve that and have that impact also for that investment by the American people?
I can start. So yes, for offshore wind, and I'll definitely be speaking about our projects. For all of our projects, we've made several substantial commitments to build a lot of the components in the U.S. To develop ports. I think Port Jefferson is where some folks are at today, and creating jobs in the U.S. another example is for our South Fork Wind project. The substation and most of the interconnection components are being made by an American company in Texas. So for a policymaker, you can put those conditions on an award for a power purchase agreement, just for an example, and incent that development in that manner.
I think American jobs has been a big positive story for the wind industry over the years. I mean, the last number I saw, which goes back a couple of years, was over 100,000 jobs on the manufacturing side, and then on the construction side, which I've spent a lot of time my last few years. I mean, my company IAA has got over 5,000 people out in the field building, and these are highly paid, skilled jobs. You mentioned GE, Paul, but I know Vestas is one of the largest suppliers of wind turbines. Has a number of plants all over this country and opened them up here to do local construction. So I think the story is there and the support is there for the jobs. And to the extent that we keep this industry humming along at a good sizable level of installed capacity each year, those jobs are going to continue. And you know, I hope the policymakers are aware of it. I think the trade associations are pushing those numbers hard, but I think there's a lot of jobs out there. And as a result of the industry, I know there are, and it's going to continue to be the case, assuming that one of these many challenges we've been talking about doesn't cause a significant slowdown, because we need to keep this industry moving along at the same pace it's at if we want to achieve some of the larger goals that have been set forward relative to the amount of renewable energy we'd like to have in this country in the next 15 or 20 years.
Well, I think it's very sophisticated supply chains already in place. They're right. These are two giant mature industries, wind and solar, for example, right now. And the logistics and supply chains are very mature. And what you're going to have is counterparty selection, who you pick. You know, a little bit of it is Darwinism, right? If people picked tier 3 or tier 4 vendors for their supply and they're having trouble getting their deliveries this year or next year due to the pandemic, they made that decision a year or two ago when others might have gone with tier 1 or tier 2 guys or other certainty or paid a different price. So I think that's part of it. The other one is, you talked about the American taxpayer and subsidies. You know, we've been talking, John, in this business for 20 years and getting off the subsidy trail. And we're basically on that glide path had COVID not hit, and it will come back soon at some point. So I would challenge this, Paul, I would answer your question with a question or a statement, not an answer. And that is, if you're going to encourage more subsidies, whether that's for offshore wind or solar or whatever, what's the incremental job versus the incremental cost to the ratepayer? You know, you can give $1 billion of subsidies and create jobs, but it's the equivalent of Tony Soprano and his crew sitting on lawn chairs. That's not a good idea, right? And I think what you have to do is look at what's the incremental benefit. Does it bring the price of that electricity down more than the subsidy? And as wind has shown onshore and solar to a certain degree the last 5 years, but the last couple decades, it's some pretty cheap electricity, and the customers want it. So I would just remind the policymakers that you may be dealing with in your current role or your former role that, you know, it's great to have great public policy to create new markets when they need that initial burst like the PTC did 20 years ago. Or I agree with John, George Bush, the first, actually signed it in his lame duck session in 1992. I just think you got to be careful that there's not a lot of spigots in Washington that are going to stay open the next 10 or 15 years. Technology is advancing. There's a tremendous amount of VC and private equity that wants to come into the energy transition. Let the markets dictate what technologies win and lose, and create better bargains for the customer, which in this case is the electric ratepayer or the electric wholesale customer in the electric grid in the U.S. And I just think it's dangerous to put too many, constantly expect 5 or 10 years of subsidies on something new. I think it needs to be happening early for something to happen. I don't disagree with that around hydrogen and some of these other new technologies. I just think it might not be there perpetually. And therefore, I think private equity or venture capital or corporate capital is a smarter way to go after it for long-term sustainability of the return and the investment in those technologies.
So I'll wrap it up here by commenting to, in particular, what Mike just said, which is from a Washington, D.C. point of view, a highly volatile topic. Mike and John in particular, but Mike, I heard for long periods of time from you that the plan for the industry was actually cut costs, improve performance, and not need the subsidy, and that has been the basis of the PTC. And the reality is, has been discussed to a large degree, and offshore is a little bit different, but to a large degree, it's been successful, actually highly successful. And wind is super cheap and below the price of other generation in many places. And that's been a great success by technology and a great success by innovators such as the world's leader in renewables, aka what Mike built. And I think what we just heard Mike advocate is that there's plenty of private sector money who knows how to drive it, and has been actually quite successful, and it's gotten it into a really big place. And I think we heard Mike advocate that corporate money is more of it than ever before in various different forms, and comment that there's been matching that to great successes and current performance, which is that's a very volatile topic compared to what's being discussed in Washington right now. So I'll have to cut it off at that. It's a very different than some other how people feel like more money is needed point from the public. And so I have to leave that highly controversial topic hanging.
Hey, Paul, if I could interrupt, one thing that might make more sense is, I think this helps all forms of renewables, is more focus on transmission and not subsidies, but incentives or permitting policy or streamlining, or maybe some tax credits. I know that's been discussed in the recent bills also. But transmission access and permitting, and whether it's federal or state regulated decision-making and interstate, when you're talking about getting cooperation across multiple states or regions of the country, very difficult the 40 years I've been in the business. And it's not going to get any easier the next 10. And I just think that's something we didn't touch on a lot today, but I think from a tax credit or incentive or things, because the grid in this country that we're all trying to inject in, whatever form of your preferred technology is largely a decentralized grid that was built, each state built, and it just happenstance interconnects with adjacent states for emergency planning reasons decades ago. It is not built like the interstate highway system in this country is built, where it was purposely built to go state to state and let everybody have access, equal access and transportation on. The electric grid in this country was not originally built, or at least 70 or 80% of it was not built to allow electrons to move state to state on a daily or hourly basis. Now it's morphed into that regionally the last 20 years, but it's largely not designed that way initially. And it's getting retrofitted, so to speak, as we speak, by some of the RTOs and ISOs and some of the incumbent rate-based utilities. But that's a bigger piece that will enable more renewables, whatever color or shape it comes out of, whether it's hydrogen or some of the renewables we discussed today. That will be a better facilitator from a public policy point of view, I would be, than just larger tax credits to make it easier for developers to get their projects finished. I don't see how that makes economic sense.
Well, that sounds like a good future next semester energy technology forum topic. Talk about transmission. Well, once again, I'd like to thank Kim, John, and Mike for participating. It's been an honor to talk to three leaders in this area who know quite a bit about this. We didn't certainly have enough time to talk through everything, but thank you to the three of you. As I mentioned up front for everyone who's watching, that the full video recording of this event will be available on the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy website in the next few days. You can also visit the Columbia CGEP full calendar for upcoming events for other areas online. This is the final session of this semester's Columbia Energy Tech Revolution Forum. And as I mentioned, we'll be resuming this forum in the new year and the new semester on 3 additional energy technology areas, transforming the energy landscape. We hope that you have a great rest of your day and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.